Good afternoon, Frank.
Hi, Professor. How are you?
So much has happened over the last week that I've been wondering how one can make sense of all of it rather than just picking one thing to start with and switching from one to another, which doesn't seem to me to be really satisfying. One needs to have a general understanding of why the whole world is turning like this. And partly because of a class I'm involved in now, I began thinking again of Manuel Castells. I'm not sure whether you've read anything by him. Manuel Castells wrote in the late 90s a three-volume paperback, about 1,500 pages, called The Information Age. And it was republished in a second edition in 2004, and now I think it's been republished as three separate volumes. And the probably the main point that he makes that what should I say is the theme for the whole book is that identity is changing. And what I was thinking was the way to make sense of so many of these things that we've been hearing the last week or so is that nation-state identity is not working anymore. Nearly every problem that comes into the news has to do with some group of people rebelling against their national identity.
Mhm.
And his three books have a lot of extremely interesting information in them about what's the way the world has been changing, especially over the last 50 years, but he goes back further than that. But he doesn't really explain why. And of course, my anthropological training wants me always to have at least a position for making sense of why things should be happening, where they're happening, and when they're happening. And I think that my usual appeal to the independent variable of population growth and the fact that more and more people flock together, given the chance, as long as the carrying capacity will allow them to do so, does illustrate the social problems that arise that make people start changing their identity or rebelling against their identity. Anyway, if we look at each of the cases in the modern world, can we say that each of them is in some sense a rebellion against national identity? I suppose the latest problem is Boehner asking Netanyahu to come and speak to the U.S. Congress, and that may be a strong fetch. But in fact, of course, there is an unprecedented struggle between two parts of the government in this country, irrespective, with no attention to what it means to the country as a whole.
Mhm.
So maybe that's something we should come back to at the end. But Scotland, Catalonia, Al-Qaeda, the Iraq, Syria, nearly everywhere you look that has come into the news recently, it's got something to do with the authority of the nation state in relation to the people within its borders. Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense, and I recognize the author. Actually, you referred me to him once, and I have one of his books. It has a very long chapter on international crime, if I remember correctly,
Yeah.
and I read that with great interest. But I think you're exactly correct because what's occurring is that boundaries, whether they were imposed 700 years ago in Scotland, or whether they were imposed in post-colonial times, have now begun to fray, and people who have been within those boundaries for generations want to get out. They want to begin to move around. They want their own identity. I don't mean move around in an ambulatory sense, but they want to be able to have their own identity. I had thought when we were going through the beginning of this that you were talking about indigenous people
Mhm.
wanting to break loose of their assigned identities as they had had them for generations. But I don't think you're quite saying that.
No, I think that, I mean, they're a problem that we've talked about before, that they haven't really got used to their identities
Right.
yet. I think before they get used to them, they're rebelling against the idea that they should get used to them.
I agree with
But
you.
then the original nation states that developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, like the Western Europe, are beginning to break apart. Well, they're not breaking apart yet, but there's in every country there is some sort of problem about the relationship between one or more communities and the national government. And in some cases, of course, they are immigrant communities.
Hmm.
One of the surprises this last month was that there was a problem in Prague, and I didn't even know about Muslims in Prague, and I didn't even know there was a significant Muslim minority in Prague. But apparently, it's becoming a problem there as well.
Well, it's interesting because in the economic markets, if you look at, for example, derivative trading, that's an entirely contrived virtual market. All right, it's really in not many instances it's the connections to reality are very tenuous. All right, people's bets on bonds are traded back and forth without any awareness by the actual bond holder. I mean, it's irrelevant. It's just somebody's betting on the value of that bond. And oftentimes, what I've seen is in the social media world, there are these virtual worlds, these virtual groups of people, who, oftentimes younger people, who are bound together with ties that are sometimes stronger than family ties, certainly stronger than national ties or cultural ties. So I guess what I'm wondering is perhaps one of the ways to either ease this pressure of people not wishing to assimilate, wanting to be independent, or perhaps as a way for them to achieve this separateness that they're looking for, would it be an idea or a stretch to think that 50 years from now, there could be a virtual Scotland extant somewhere in the cloud that people belong to and experience?
I suspect that the interest in Scottish identity is simply a stage towards something else. It's a rebellion against the national identity that the Scots and the Welsh and some of the Irish had got used to in the last 300 years, but that it won't stay like that, because after all, you don't have to spend much time in Scotland to realise that the Scots there's a lot of difference between different parts of Scotland,
Yes.
and the same in Wales.
Hmm.
So the what Castell says is that it's a conflict between the self and the net. Now, the way I understand that is that the global community, which is gradually forming, is something people are becoming more and more aware of, but it doesn't provide identity.
Hmm.
And people are trying to find identity within it. However, the identities that used to be so important for us, starting with kinship and marriage and family, are not serving the same purpose as they used to. So families aren't what they used to be.
Right.
The ties we form in college that have in the past been very important in old boy networks through a large part of people's lives aren't serving the same purpose they used to. Professional ties, religious ties, because the religious community is getting very large and there are differences of opinion within it. So all these old-fashioned identities that used to work very well for relatively small numbers of people are ceasing to work, as every community, every arena of interaction, every group of people that feels that it's everybody understands each other as being the same sort of person, gets larger and larger.
But hasn't the premise and the promise always been that as new people came in to the hole, into the net, so to speak, that these same institutions, old boy networks, religion, family, would then extend to them and they would then in turn adopt them? I mean, hadn't that always been the case? Anyway, I still am always surprised when I'm in London and I hear somebody from Africa or the West Indies speak to me in perfect British accented English.
Yeah, yeah.
It causes me to, I mean, as an American, you don't hear that.
Well,
And
actually, I mean, it happens to me with students who've just come from China or Iran and never been out of their own countries before, and they speak perfect English without an accent.
really,
Yeah. Uh, but on the other hand, France always was very good at assimilating people to a French identity and a French language identity,
hmm,
and yet France, it's not working in France anymore. I
right,
mean,
right.
De Val's prime minister said France is now an apartheid country
Hmm,
this
hmm.
week.
I saw that.
So things, forms of assimilation that were working, and for France it was a sort of fairly homogeneous intellectual community that where it worked. So it was a class of society, but it was generally felt as being open,
Yes, it
whereas
was
in England it was more
closed.
stratified. So people who assimilated to an English identity assimilated to a particular level of English identity.
Hmm.
But in each case, those forms of assimilation aren't working anymore.
Well, are they not working, or are they not working for certain people?
We would need a bigger sample than we have to know that, but certainly there are a lot of problems with them.
Hmm.
Because the fact that there are these no-go areas in France and similar situations in parts of England
Hmm.
is completely new.
Well, then maybe we're looking at this the wrong way. Maybe we should look at how did something that worked to assimilate for many generations, why has it suddenly stopped working?
Well, my position about this so far is that it has to do with the size of the communities that would be looking for a common identity, and that gradually identity for communities of that size is not working, and people are rebelling against any sort of uh, identity for a community of that size. However, there are two things going on. One is a move in the new direction, and another is resistance against that move. So that is people moving with the flow, moving with the new social forces that make them negotiate their
Mm,
personal identity with whoever they're in contact with and need to work with. While on the other hand, people afraid of losing what they had, the relationships they had before, resisting that process. And most of what's happening in the Islamic world and in Islamic communities in France and England is people trying to hold on to Islam and prevent the social forces that would break down those relationships that they grew up with.
right. No, I can see that. And it's interesting because as more and more, as the greater aggregate numbers of people begin to get into the assimilation assembly line, all right, waiting to become swallowed and homogenized, if you will, typically what that would mean is that the greater whole would A, have to accept them, and then after accepting them and homogenizing them, the greater whole itself would not necessarily take a step in their direction, but be expanded to accept them. And so
Mm-hmm.
what's happening now is not only are the people in the assembly line not willing to take that last step because they wish to retain certain cultural or religious identities, but because of their actions to date while waiting in the assembly line, the people in the greater whole are like, don't come in. We don't want you. So there's a real disruption now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, so, but then we've the larger problem on more international level is the relationship between the West and the Western world and the Middle East, so that we've got now these conferences going on between some people against how to deal with other people, and Cameron and Hollande and Barack Obama and Netanyahu in different ways, planning to try to control what goes on in the Middle East instead of trying to accommodate the changes that are going on. They're not thinking in terms of change yet. We still haven't got used to thinking in terms of change and looking ahead.
No, no, we haven't. And I think Netanyahu may have made a big misstep because Obama today announced that he was not going to see him when he
Mm-hmm.
came.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, if Netanyahu comes here and does not see the president, I don't think he's going to win the Israeli election in the spring.
Well, I'm sure that's the calculation that's going on behind the scenes all the time.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
And it's not only his election, it's several other elections that are happening this year as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. No, it's going to be a very interesting time.
Uh,
And I'm not. You keep saying you're optimistic. I don't know how you can be.
Depends how far ahead you look.
Well, I was very pleased that the European Central Bank came out with this quantitative easing plan today,
Yes, yes,
because
yes.
what Draghi was able to do was to take it was almost as if he had put on his Francois Monet costume, and was able to take a big whack at that structural overhaul that needs to be done. I mean, they have 16 different national debt markets over there. There's no way they can really guarantee the issuing of an EU-wide bond. So it's time to take advantage of the disarray and to make some changes.
But the trouble is, as far as I can see from what I've been able to read in the media, neither, not Merkel, not Hollande, not Cameron, none of them have made any useful proposals about how to modify the current structure of the EU to make it work better.
It's almost on a national level what we were just talking about on an individual level.
Mm.
Here you have nations that are reluctant to give up their individual identities.
And there's going to be a crisis on that with the British election in May.
There will be, there will be, and it's going to trickle over to the continent if the
Hmm.
economy does not improve. And ultimately, what's going to happen is the Germans, who are so dependent upon the European economy, I mean, they're going to have to bite the bullet, and they're going to have to agree to getting into some debt instrument pool with the likes of Greece and Portugal and Spain. Because if they don't do that, they're going to lose their export market,
Yeah,
and they're going to
yeah.
face a tough time. And if England doesn't move toward the continent by then, and moves in the opposite direction, they may find themselves alone, which is seemingly where they always want to be anyway.
So things get more and more exciting, and if you're optimistic, it's very interesting.
Or if you're pessimistic, it's an excuse to do I don't know what. So we can experiment more with Google and try to find a better way to broadcast. Okay.
See
All
you
right,
next
Brian,
week.
thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.